In a world darkened by ethnic conflicts that tear nations apart, Canada stands as a model of how people of different cultures can live and work together in peace, prosperity, and mutual respect.
Quotes like this come to mind when we think about multiculturalism. Canada, the world's role model. But what would happen if we dig a little deeper, if we truly investigate what's behind the notion of multiculturalism? Would we find a reality or a myth? Let's discover a side of Canada that we didn't expect.
So who actually is Canada? What is multiculturalism? What may be hiding behind the mask of Canadian multiculturalism?
From an international perspective, Canada is perceived as very progressive in its multiculturalism policies and appears to have succeeded in establishing a peaceful coexistence between people of different ethnicities. The Canadian government claims to have solved the problems that occur in multicultural societies, and the Canadian school system is seen as a successful model of multicultural education. The Canadian mosaic is an image that represents these ideas of Canadian multicultural policies best, as it incorporates unity and diversity.
But what exactly is the mosaic model, and what are multicultural policies?
The mosaic model evolved in the early 20th century as a contrast to the popular US-American melting pot model, which was designed to create unity and homogeneity. The melting pot model assumes that members of ethnocultural communities are willing to give up their ethnically distinctive characteristics to create a society of one people, one nation, and one culture over time. The mosaic model pursues a different goal: unity and heterogeneity. It aims at one nation of many cultures, a society of different ethnic communities whose members are able and willing to maintain their ethnocultural distinctiveness. In this model, the position of the citizen within the mosaic would not depend on ethnicity but individual achievements. It is the democratic ideal of an open class society in which everyone has the same rights and opportunities, also called meritocracy. The Canadian mosaic is only a fairly recent progress and outgrows the previous ideal of a cultural dualism between the two founding partners of Canada, the French Catholics in the province of Quebec and the English Protestants outside of Quebec. The mosaic myth developed in the post-World War II period when a massive immigration to Canada took place. At first, it didn't have any effects on public policies. It was assumed that immigrants would assimilate to the British institutional and cultural model, including language and religion. Only after World War II did the Canadian government see a need to react to the cultural diversity that had arisen in the country. The first multiculturalism policies were announced in 1971 under Prime Minister Trudeau and mainly focused on minority involvement, intercultural exchange, and ratified Canada as a bilingual country. These objectives earned harsh criticism from scholars and concerned citizens. They argued that the emphasis on culture distracted from the inequalities in political and economic powers across ethnic groups, and criticized that the policies did not support ethnic minorities in their empowerment. Furthermore, multiculturalism within bilingual framework did not make sense. To the critics, it only represented the government's attempt to appease and contain demands of immigrant minorities and French Quebecers. They argued that these policies would only ensure the continuation of the Anglo-Saxon dominance and political control in Canada. Completely excluded from the multicultural policies of 1971 were the Aboriginal peoples, who were not addressed at all, and due to their fear of losing their special status, they did not want to be judged together with the other ethnic groups, since they wanted to keep their Aboriginal and treaty rights. In total, no concrete guarantees of support for ethnic groups were offered, and the demands for political, economical, and social equality not fulfilled. The Multiculturalism Act of 1988 offered more positive features. The Act recognizes multiculturalism as a fundamental characteristic of the Canadian heritage, includes reference to racial as well as cultural equality, and finally mentions the Aboriginal peoples. It has also given legitimate basis to immigrants of ethnic minorities for making claims on public policy and public funds. Still, critics like Neil Besodath and Richard Gwynne claim that multiculturalism has promoted a form of ethnic separation amongst immigrants. The Multiculturalism Act has also not offered any clear explanation what is meant by the term. Some scholars argue that it is only an empty buzzword or ambiguous catchword charged with so many meanings that it has no meaning at all. The term multiculturalism can invite to the assumption that the problem of Canadian diversity is already solved. Whether it is seen as social reality, federal government policy, or just a myth-based ideology, multiculturalism is clearly not static, but a dynamic concept and a still ongoing process.
How is multiculturalism represented in other areas of state policy?
Let's take a look at the Canadian immigration system. Canadian history has largely been shaped by immigration. Immigrants helped in building the economy of the country and ensured population growth. However, the contribution of immigrants to Canadian welfare hasn't always been recognized. An example of this is the notorious Chinese Immigration Act of 1885 and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923. Canada had used the Chinese labor to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, but after the completion of the project there was no more need for Chinese newcomers, and the act employed rather harsh measures to keep them away from the country. The first act obliged the Chinese entering the country to pay a head tax much higher than most of them could afford, and the second one almost completely banned Chinese immigration with the exception of diplomats and foreign students. For the most part of the 20th century, Asian and African immigrants had to face a strong racial bias when coming and settling up in Canada. Racism was part of governmental policy implemented in laws. For example, in the 1952 Immigration Act, the reasons for prohibiting entry included nationality, citizenship, ethnic group, as well as peculiar customs, habits, and modes of life. Racial discrimination was also expressed in official speeches, such as the Prime Minister Mackenzie King's speech in the House of Commons in 1947.
Large-scale immigration from the Orient world would change the fundamental composition of the Canadian population and give rise to social and economic problems.
Since that time, there has been a considerable improvement in the immigration determination system. Worldwide, Canada is one of the countries with the highest number of immigrants. However, there has been a concern about non-white immigrants being discriminated and allocation of jobs. Highly qualified immigrants from non-Western countries often find it difficult to enter a job corresponding with their knowledge and level of education.
How is the situation of those newcomers lacking proper education levels?
Here we are speaking about refugees. Canada now has a reputation as one of the most welcoming countries to accept those in need of shelter. In 1969, Canada signed the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees. According to the convention, a refugee is defined as
a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his or her nationality.
Whether a refugee claimant meets the commonly accepted definition of refugee and can be granted the status largely depends on the determination system of the country. The Canadian officials and the Minister of Citizenship, Immigration and Multiculturalism, Jason Kenney, have recently considered this determination system of Canada as being too mild and processing too many refugee claims. For some asylum seekers, their claim is a matter of life and death, but due to numerous refugee claims, they sometimes have to wait for years before they can get the decision on their case. According to the officials, the problem is only the presence of too many bogus refugee claimants. The term bogus refugee was coined in the 1990s when some politicians and the media expressed skepticism about the credibility of the claims of many asylum seekers. Jason Kenney states,
62% of asylum seekers are found to have bogus claims.
Making the immigration determination system more effective and keeping the so-called bogus refugees away is an official explanation of the Canadian government to introduce Bill C-31, or Protecting Canada's Immigration System Act. The act has been in force since the 15th of December 2012, but the controversy about it began much earlier, when it received the royal assent in June 2012. Local and international public press and social organizations such as the Canadian Council for Refugees, Canadian Doctors for Refugee Care, the Canadian Association for Refugee Lawyers, and Amnesty International have been protesting against the bill.
What is wrong with the new legislation?
Under this new law, the decision of whether the refugee claimant is true, bona fide, or bogus will depend on his or her country of origin.
Why should the country of origin play a role?
Because the new bill differentiates between safe and non-safe countries. As so-called safe countries aren't likely to produce refugees, the claimants from these countries will have less time to prove their need of protection, no access to refugee appeal division, and no access to healthcare services except when presenting a danger to public health. On the 15th of December of 2012, the Minister of Citizenship, Immigration and Multiculturalism, Jason Kenney, designated 26 European countries and the United States as safe. More countries are to be added to the safe list in the coming months, as CIC reports. Under the regulations of the new bill, even countries with obvious human rights violations could be recognized as safe. A vivid example is Mexico. Although thousands of people there are being killed in drug wars, it still has all the chances to receive the safe status under the new legislation. Veronica Castro claimed refugee status in Canada because of the fear of domestic violence in her native Mexico. She made a claim in 2010 and had to wait for 2 years for a decision of the Immigration Board that finally recognized her claims as unfounded. Deported back to Mexico, she was robbed and killed just a few days after the arrival. Refugees often become the victims of violence. However, some refugee claimants are considered by the government to be dangerous themselves. A lot of refugees are being held in detention centers all over Canada. One of the reasons for detention can be the need to clarify the refugee's identity. The most common one, however, is being suspected of the link with criminal or terrorist organizations. This situation is a manifestation of the so-called war on terrorism, which began as a result of the events of September 11th. Following the tragedy, Canada implemented an anti-terrorist act that by many was accused of violating both the Canadian Charter of Rights and the UN Human Rights Convention.
Are refugee claimants victims or criminals?
Assessing the modern situation, it seems the government tends to stand in favor of the second definition. According to the Star, refugees in detention face health problems and have to fight with depression. Moreover, children who are not allowed to be detained under the law often stay in detention with their parents, as the Canadian Council for Refugees reports. The new bill widens the power of the Minister of Public Safety to detain refugees. The minister can designate a group of refugees arriving in Canada as an irregular arrival. This automatically leads to the detention of the whole group for at least a year. The measure is supposed to target human smugglers, but it punishes innocent refugees together with the criminals. Just on the 5th of December in 2012, 5 groups of 85 Romani refugees were designated as irregular arrival. They are held up in detention, among them 35 children, with no evidence of them being a threat to the public. After taking a look at the immigration system, it is necessary to examine how law enforcers are handling the confusion between the multicultural policies and the immigration legislations. For decades, police forces across the country have been accused of various acts of institutional racism. There are two frequent accusations leveled at the police. Firstly, officers are accused of under-policing minority communities when their members are victims of crime. Secondly, at the same time, police are accused of over-policing minorities when their members are suspected to be responsible for a crime. Canada has had a couple of high-profile cases of under-policing. A serial killer named Robert Pickton murdered prostitutes and drug users in Vancouver. A former judge named David Ramsey used his position of power to take advantage of young Aboriginal prostitutes who were living in poverty and frequently in trouble with the law. However, many cases remain unsolved, and the violence against women in vulnerable situations persists.
Since the 1970s, over 3,000 women have gone missing or been murdered in Canada. More than half are under the age of 31. 80% have left children and grandchildren. The majority have been Indigenous women. No one has been charged in over 150 of the confirmed homicides. 300 of the official cases are still unsolved.
Tiffany Duro,
Angela Jardine,
Tanya Holliak,
Sherry Irving,
Inga Hall, Diana Melnick,
Deborah Jones,
Wendy Crawford,
Andrea Boraven,
Kira Ellis,
Carrie Koski,
Dorothy Spence.
The tragedy of missing women is parallel across the country, and memorial marches in honor of the women are held in various cities. Family members and activists have organized walks for justice to press the federal government for an inquiry into the missing women along Highway 16, now referred to as the Highway of Tears.
I think the systemic violence against women is not an anomaly. It's not a phenomena that one man has done this horrific thing. I think it is a result of the systemic attitude towards poor women.
The issue has now started receiving international attention with the release of the Amnesty International human rights reports and the denunciation of Canada at the United Nations. Nevertheless, the problem remains invisible to most of the Canadian society. Due to the under-policing problem, the Aboriginal youth have become untrusting of the fairness of the justice system. They no longer see worth in filing their legal complaints. Therefore, Native groups are demanding a public inquiry to investigate wider concerns about the justice system's treatment of Aboriginal people. On the other hand, we have the widely discussed issue of over-policing. In eastern Canada, the issue of over-policing has been framed by specific concerns about police engaging in racial profiling of the Black community.
Racial profiling can be defined as investigative or enforcement activity initiated by an individual officer based on his or her stereotypical, prejudicial, or racist perception of who is likely to be involved in wrongdoing or criminal activity.
In 2002, this issue took the front stage when the Toronto Star published a series of articles alleging that statistics collected by the Toronto Police Services confirmed what many Black residents of Toronto had believed for many years, namely, that the Toronto police force practiced racial profiling. The analysis showed that Black people are overrepresented in certain charge categories, treated more harshly than whites after they were arrested, and much more likely to be held in custody for bail hearings than their white counterparts. In response to the Star series, the Toronto police strongly denied all allegations of racial bias. The police chief declared,
"We do not do racial profiling. There is no racism."
Likewise, the president of the Police Association stated,
No racial profiling has ever been conducted by the Toronto Police Service.
Several local politicians echoed these sentiments. The mayor of Toronto, for example, declared,
I don't believe that the Toronto police engage in racial profiling in any way, shape or form. Quite the opposite. They are very sensitive to our different communities.
Unfortunately, the police have yet to produce concrete data that can lend support to their no racism argument. The question is,
Does racial profiling really exist in Canada?
William Kloss, Chief of Police in Kingston, Ontario, felt that the debate about racial profiling needed to move beyond accusations and denials. Consequently, he agreed to carry out a study to examine whether racial profiling was being practiced in Kingston. The statistics of police stops were analyzed by criminologist Scott Wortley. The study found that Black and Aboriginal residents of Kingston were indeed over-policed. When the results were announced, Chief Kloss apologized to members of Kingston's Black and Aboriginal communities, saying,
Especially to the Black community and the Aboriginal community where there's disparities, we apologize. I apologize. I'm not asking any police officer to apologize in this room. My police officers have the right to leave this room and walk tall with pride. What we are doing wrong, if we are doing anything wrong, is systematic, and that's my problem. So I apologize to the Black community, the Aboriginal community, and we will do better.
In 2005, the Ontario Human Rights Commission also published a study of racial profiling in order to move the debate a step forward. One of its findings was that
African Canadian community in particular stressed that racial profiling is having an overwhelming impact in their community. The sense of injustice that develops among individuals in these communities creates a state of psychological imbalance and inner conflict and reinforces their concern that racism exists and that they may be subjected to it at any time.
clearly, the issue of racial profiling requires further research in this country. Unfortunately, Canadian law enforcement agencies, with the exception of the Kingston, Ontario Police Service, have thus far refused to collect their own data on this phenomenon. What we have shown until now demonstrates that even though Canada has been labeled as the successful model of multiculturalism, human rights violations are still taking place. The testimonial of Jim Poitras stands as an example of the difficulties that ethnic minorities have to face.
This is about our human rights as a people. And we just want to be heard. That's it. And we want to be respected and not treated like a second-class citizen, like we don't exist. Because we do exist. See, we've been fighting for our human rights since the Confederation of Canada, because there were treaties that were done in the 1800s, and our elders of the past made agreements with the Crown, Queen Elizabeth, she's the Crown, that there would be no more wars, and that we would live in peace, and that the Canadian government, which was part of the Commonwealth of England at the time, still is, even though they say they're not, it still is. And and that we would share the wealth so that everybody could live in harmony and peace. That was the foundation of the treaties. And they've never kept any of their promises. It's always been about the land. What's under the land and what's on top of the land, okay? Greed. Oil, mining, uranium, water. Because we have native people in the north, we in Canada, we've been aware of this world climate for a very long time. And yes, it will get worse because it's gone past the point. About 4 years ago, a piece of ice left part of the Arctic Circle, and it was big as Newfoundland. And that was in the news, but only for a day. And because of the warming of the climate, it's getting much milder up north, and already all the powers of the earth, whether it be Canadian, American, Russian, whoever it is, they know there's a lot of oil up there. So they're all fighting over the land now. A lot of Canadians are really not educated at all. And they think all Indians have life so great and it's just handed to them. You know, everybody's a welfare bum. No, this is the reality. And for many people, even today. And it's the $8 billion a year that the federal government gets from the federal budget to take care of the Indians. For over half of that goes towards Indian affairs to pay their own people. Now, okay, there's also money missing within the bands. This is an issue, and First Nations people are totally aware of that. Corruption is corruption. So I suggest to the Canadian public, to Canadian taxpayers, because it's their money, where's the money? Billions and billions of dollars. Where did it go? Because you can go on many reservations today. It's like going into the third world. Some have no electricity, some have no running water, no health care, nothing. Let's say an Indian commits a crime. A crime's a crime, right? I don't have a problem with that. But if a native rapes a white woman, he goes straight to jail. Don't pass go, don't collect no money, you go straight to jail. Prison. Guaranteed. Two white university students raped a native woman. She happened to be a prostitute, right? And they beat her severely and raped her. They got no prison time. And the judge, it almost started a riot. The judge in Regina said, oh, they're just two good boys. They got carried away. They didn't mean no harm. That's a fact. It's the whole judicial system has to be changed. The whole political atmosphere has to be changed. It is so one-sided. Yes, we got bad people just like any other culture. We're not denying that. I was raised in the white world, and I knew lots of people because I'm a nice guy, right? And I was a rock and roller back in those days. So people come to my house to party, and then I'd have all these posters of great chiefs on the walls, and the white people and the Barbie dolls. They would look at the poster. Oh, look at those fucking Indians, and then they realized in me, I was in the room. They'd look at, oh, gee, Jim, I didn't mean you. You're damn right, you meant me. I had people throw bottles and stuff for moving cars at me. I've been not served in a restaurant because of the color of my skin in Canada. But it wasn't until I got older and I started to heal all what I needed to heal. I said, no, my money's just as good as anybody else's money. Finally found my family in 1988, those that were still alive. Met my mother, father, met some aunties and uncles, ton of cousins. Out of 9 siblings that we know of, I was kept the longest. All my other siblings were taken at birth. Because under the law in Canada, especially with Indians, because see, we're separate, we have different laws. And that's the issue that's not being addressed. Where the government could come in and take the children without the consent of the mother or the children. And may my mother rest in peace. She went through the residential school. It destroyed her. She was only 51 when she died. So she was an alcoholic and a prostitute, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. So because she wasn't married, Legally, they use that to go in and take the kids. She had a mate when I was a baby, but when he died, then that's when they came and took me. I was 2.5. And I was in an orphanage in a residential school when I was a baby, and that's where I was first sexually abused. I remember it. People say kids don't have memories. We do. And then I was fostered out, wasn't adopted. I was fostered out when I was about 3.5, 4 years old. And I got lucky. I had a hard childhood, but I got lucky because my foster mother was a really beautiful human being. My foster father was difficult man, but overall, I was very lucky to get into the family I got because most of the kids that they took were the kids nobody else wanted. We were all sexually abused, mentally, physically abused, emotionally disturbed children, and these are the children that they took. So I was lucky, but I only lasted there till I was 15. I had to leave. I couldn't take it anymore, so I left. Because I was one of the very few Indians living in that community. It's not a feel sorry story, it's the truth. And it was being one of the very few Native kids in a white community. This was hard. I had to learn how to fight really young. When I became a professional artist 20 years ago, I realized I have a gift. I have a reason, I have a purpose in life now, and that's to be a storyteller. And many of my paintings, I try to paint positive images of the culture. The world has to wake up to this, that Canada isn't this pretty little place on the planet. We've got issues just like every other country, but in North America, they're only just starting to admit. All I try to do is try to speak about these things, and I'm 60 years old now, so I don't know how much. I hope the Creator gives me many more years, but I have to stand up. I have to talk for I'm a great grandfather. You know, this is for my grandchildren, my great grandchildren, and for the future generations. This is not about us. This is about the future generations, that they inherit a better planet than what they got now.